The Prime Minister continues to tell provinces if they don't like the carbon tax, come up with an alternative credible plan. Well, at least one Premier, Nova Scotia's Tim Houston, has submitted a counter-proposal with no carbon price, but others remain opposed simply to what's currently in place.
The carbon tax has been tried, it's failed, it's punitive, people don't like it, especially in the middle of an affordability crisis. It's got to go.
This carbon tax has to go, or in a year and a half the Prime Minister's going. As simple as that. He will be going, I'll guarantee you.
Any jurisdiction can develop a sufficiently stringent and rigorous plan that meets the federal benchmark, and we will gladly let them do it.
A number of economists recently signed a letter defending the price on carbon, and two signatories of that letter join me now. Don Drummond is an adjunct professor at Queen's University, and Stephen Gordon is an economics professor at Laval University. Gentlemen, it's good to speak with you. Thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Look, before we get into the arguments you're making here in the letter about carbon pricing as a policy, not necessarily the Liberal carbon policy, I want to get your response to the criticism of this letter. We've heard the Premier of Alberta say that you need to come out of your ivory towers and live where the real people live. And the opposition leader's office has dismissed you as Justin Trudeau's so-called experts. Don Drummond, what do you make of that response to your attempts here to bring some insight to this debate?
I think there needs to be two stages applied here. The first is, do we want to do something about climate change? Whether it's the specifics, we have a target of 2030, we have other targets. Do you want to try to achieve those targets? If the answer is that no, then it's a completely different ballgame. You don't presumably then need the carbon tax and a whole bunch of other things. But if the answer to that is yes, and I hope on behalf of Canadians it is yes, because climate change is a real and present danger, then you need some policies to align it. And the work that we have done, whether it's economists or others, and in my particular background with the Eco-Fiscal Commission, have suggested that a carbon tax is the most efficient, least economically damaging way to do it. All open to all kinds of alternatives, but it needs to be demonstrated that the alternatives can achieve the target at lower costs. And I'm not aware of alternatives that can do that.
So, Stephen Gordon, what are your thoughts on the criticism of you and your colleagues who signed this letter?
Well, I don't think any of us expected anything less or more, depending on how you look at it. And all we can really say is this is not an idea that belongs to the Liberals. This is an idea that belongs to the world. Economists have been saying this thing over and over again for decades, and the fact that the Liberals happen to have taken it on doesn't make it a Liberal policy. It's carbon pricing is a well-established, highly documented, exhaustively researched issue, and all we can just say is, well, if that's how you want to react, there is not much else we can really do to say anything other than this is the idea, we support the idea, and that's it.
So, Stephen Gordon, just to stick with you, one of the criticisms in attacking the idea, and certainly the increase that we saw on April 1st, is that this makes everything more expensive. The letter that you have signed has said that it is not really fundamentally driving costs. Explain to me how increasing price on gas, price on pollution, doesn't have a knock-on effect in the economy of real consequence.
Inflation is a sustained and widely dispersed increase in prices. These are one-off increases of one sector. When the Bank of Canada is looking at inflation, it's not looking at that. It's looking for more like excess demand, supply chain disruptions, things like that. This is just a drop in the ocean. Technically, yes, it does feed into the CPI and it shows up in inflation, but the contribution over the last few years is basically rounding error at most. So it just, yes, of course, it increases some costs. Of course, anybody who's paying that cost is also receiving the rebate, and the rebate offsets. And for most Canadians who are paying this, for most Canadians, that increase in the rebate more than compensates for that lost buying power.
So, Don Drummond, how do we square that analysis with what we've seen from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who did a financial analysis that said on cash out, cash in, people are better off, as Stephen Gordon just said. But when you factor in the economic dampening effect, this is what the Conservatives and premiers are seizing on in particular, people are worse off. How do we square these two different conclusions?
Well, that comes back to my step one. Are you trying to achieve a certain target for emissions? And the Parliamentary Budget Officer did not apply that test. So they're saying ever so slightly the carbon tax would depress economic growth. I mean, we're talking about rounding error, basically. And then he says, well, on that basis, you don't get all the money back. But he did not then impose the counterfactual. If you don't have the carbon tax and want to hit those targets, you have to impose something else. And had that been done by the parliamentary office, it would have shown a greater cost, because everything we've ever analyzed and others have analyzed have more of a negative impact on economic growth. So he really didn't do, the Parliamentary Budget Office really didn't do a complete analysis, because they didn't look at what would be required to replace the carbon tax in order to allow us to hit the carbon emissions targets.
So, but Don Drummond, it's the analysis that's out there. It's the analysis that's in the debate. It has some different conclusions because of the limitations of the work that was done than the letter you signed. How do Canadians square that? Because they don't have anything else to hold it against. You say everything else, all the other options, will be more harmful to the economy and more expensive. How much more harmful? How much more expensive? And does it matter in terms of if people don't pay the retail price anymore, would they feel it as much?
Well, I just hope Canadians, I have the greatest sympathy, because this debate has been very hard to crack into, and they're always given partial stories. So I would hope any Canadian interested in this, in a dialogue with anybody, would ask those same two questions. First of all, do you believe we should try to hit these emission target reductions? If that person says yes, then I think the second question is, okay, if not using the carbon tax, how do you suggest we hit it? And that's where there's no answer at the moment. Nobody is suggesting what would replace the carbon tax. And let's look at the Canadian Climate Institute, including the carbon tax and including everything else, not only in place but planned, we still don't hit the targets. So the carbon tax forms an important part of hitting the targets, but even with it, we're still a shortfall. What is going to replace it? And that's what Canadians aren't being told. And it's, oh, well, we'll do something else. We'll do regulation. Well, guess what? Regulations have a cost as well. As soon as you try to force somebody to do something they're not going to do naturally, you're extracting a cost, and nobody's confessing up to that cost.
So, Stephen Gordon, how much more expensive would the alternatives be for the average Canadian? I can see how more intense regulation would be more expensive for a company and for a business, and I guess we need to see the knock-on effects of that. But what kind of extra costs are we talking about here?
Well, then, if you're going to be going into things like subsidies, well, that's an immediate cost right there. But the answer to that really depends on, well, what kind of alternative are you specifying? If you're going to be doing a really dumb thing, that's going to be really much more expensive. Slightly less dumb, slightly less expensive. What we know is that carbon pricing is the least costly, and anything else is going to be more. If anybody thinks that they can come up with something that doesn't involve carbon pricing and that is less costly, show us the math, show us the measures. This is what we've been working on for generations. This is the best we come up with. Somebody's got something better. Let's see it.
Well, right now,
let us go through it too, because we know how to do this by now.
Well, right, and this is why I wanted to get your opinion on this, because what we're hearing is essentially get rid of the carbon price, Stephen Gordon, and look at these other things we're doing on the emissions reduction side. Nova Scotia has bundled together its clean energy plan, its climate plan. Manitoba, it sounds like, is going to do the same. The Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador wants a First Minister's meeting on this. What happens if carbon pricing goes away? And we have all the different jurisdictions coming up with their own regimes here in Canada. Can we hit the targets? I mean, is there a consistency? How do we do it?
Well, there's an immediate risk of the race to the bottom, right? Why would these premiers, why would these provinces even do anything? They're going to, if they really think they're going to reduce emissions by these amounts that their targets, they're going to be doing it at in a more costly fashion. The fact that they have all these whole wealth of, regulations, caps, permits, whatever, that's going to generate costs. And one of the things about the more complex, the more measures you add in, the more easy it is to actually hide what those costs are. So when you have a really simple and transparent measure like the carbon tax, we can calculate the cost pretty quickly. We also know they're almost certainly going to be we know certainly they will be less than any of the alternatives. The alternatives are, to a certain extent, a lot of it is a smokescreen. You just have a whole wealth of acronyms and measures that won't do the job, and whatever it is they will do will be at a higher cost.
So Don Drummond, the Liberal plan as it exists right now, and I do want to point out, you didn't sign this letter, none of you, to endorse the Liberal plan, but the concept of carbon pricing as a pure economic tool to deal with this. The Liberal plan is a blend of carbon pricing, emissions caps, regulations, and some subsidies, as we're seeing in like EV and an industrial policy. How effective do you think that blended approach is, and how vulnerable do you think this whole framework is right now, given where the politics have gone and the way the Liberals have handled it?
Well, again, I'll come back to the Canadian Climate Institute study just released. It shows that with everything in the works, everything in place, we're still not hitting the target. Getting close, but still some more work to be done there. A huge gap if we don't move ahead on the consumer part of the carbon tax, and then we have to look at something else. I guess to put a number to something you were discussing with Stephen just a minute ago, the alternatives. One of those alternatives, a subsidy we did analyze in the Eco-Fiscal Commission in 2017, is the electric vehicle subsidies in Quebec. And we found that those subsidies were lowering emissions at a cost of $395 a ton. So put that in contrast, the carbon tax is working as of April 1st at $80 a ton. There's one alternative amongst very many. And we can do the same thing for everything else. Everything else anybody wants to suggest, you can do the cost estimates. And if it works better, it's great. But that's not what's been found today. We need the carbon price. And you refer to Nova Scotia, but Nova Scotia still has a gap towards their own objectives. And it includes assumptions like closing down all their coal-fired plants. That hasn't happened yet. And there's a very strange thing in that letter, because right at the beginning, it says that the consumers of the province cannot change their behavior. Well, if they don't change their behavior, then why does the province assume they're going to go to solar panels and heat pumps? Isn't that a change in behavior? And how do you explain that the emissions from car travel in Nova Scotia have gone down quite a bit? I would bet if you did an analysis that the increase in the carbon tax and increase of price has something to do with that. So you can't really have it both ways. You can't say that they won't change their behavior, so a carbon tax doesn't work, but other elements, which are a subsidy, will work. It's all part of that assumption. If you provide the right incentives, the behavior will change. And that's what underlines the premise of the carbon tax.
Right, and so Stephen Gord, just as the last question, I mean, the Liberals, this is their signature, central environmental policy, but they've been criticized for carving out home heating oil and doing things to really undermine the core of what is at their plan. How vulnerable has that made this whole thing?
Well, quite a bit. They've really struggled to make an effort to explain what how it works and why. I've often said that the Liberals has basically outsourced explaining the carbon tax to a dozen economics profs on Twitter. And the most recent moves, the subsidies for EVs, the home heating oil carve out, it's kind of hard for us to keep the enthusiasm. They had a good idea and they're just whittling away at it. And there's, many of us signed that letter basically in despair almost. Well, somebody's got to say something good about carbon pricing because we're the only ones left. That's basically where we are at this point. There's sometimes why the criticisms of basically being in for the Liberals, like, no, we're here for the carbon tax. Someone might, if conservatives, whoever wants to attack all those regulations and subsidies and carve outs, we'd be on board with that.
So, Don Drummond, if the change that the premiers and the opposition are calling for comes, either Canada has a less ambitious climate plan and emissions do not decrease as expected, or things get even more expensive because of the suite of other measures that will be required to get us on this path as a country.
Yeah, I think there's, again, those two steps. There's two types of debates Canada would have under that circumstances. Are we going to take climate change seriously and do what we can do within a reasonable economic cost? That has been the path for a while now. And if that's questioned and we're not going to do that, I think that has very serious consequences. And we have to consider this is no longer hypothetical. Look at British Columbia, look at Ontario and Quebec with the forest fires and the flooding. We've seen the severity and the number of these environment-related disasters increase, we see the impact of that on housing and public infrastructure and health and the like. I think that calls for us to take it seriously. And if we're going to take it seriously, then we need the measures that do the trick efficiently. If not this suite of actions, including the carbon tax, then what else? But allow the ideas to be put out there so they can be analyzed for Canadians and decide, well, there's a better way, great. We'll endorse that better way, but I haven't seen anybody proposing a better way.
Don Drummond and Stephen Gordon, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Pleasure.